Hey everybody, welcome to a special edition of This Day in Hockey. They've been few and far between the last few days, but I'll continue every now and then and try and bang one out for you. And well, today is a special anniversary for not just Montreal Canadian fans, even though I'm representing today. Representing this is one of the first sweaters I ever bought, man. It's back in the 70s. I got Cornway's number on it. It's been hanging around in a dresser for a long time. I just thought it was appropriate to put on today, even though I'm not talking about Yvon, but I am talking about a right winger. And I'm talking about a right winger who shot left. And yes, Maurice the Rocket Richard. And I have had a few this days in hockey that have involved him. This one a little bit more specific because it is the 20th anniversary of his death. He died 20 years ago today, May 27th, 2000. And I certainly remember it. And he had been ill. He was in the hospital, 78, and fighting a variety of illnesses, cancer-related and among others. And I didn't expect him to come out. So certainly bad news was probably forthcoming at some point in time. That said, anytime you lose an icon, it's still a little bit of a shock to the system, and it certainly was that day. I wanted to do my own thing, right? I mean, there's some great stuff, of course, that's been posted on the anniversary of his death or leading up to it. My dear friend Dave Stubbs, if you haven't had a chance to read what he wrote for NHL.com, it's a great story and does include quotes from one of Rocket's sons, which is fantastic. It just lends a little bit more of a personal feeling to it as you try and go back years later, whether you try and encompass the man's life or his career. What hasn't been said? So I'm not here today to regale you with his stats and try and give you the significance of his cultural impact, such as it was in the 40s and 50s. But I am going to try and give you a little bit of something about the man personally, because I did meet him. And I think right away that puts you in a different criteria. The background on that was I was a owner, one of three, of a bar in Ottawa called the Original Six in the late 80s and into the very early 90s. And in November of 1989, when Gordie Howe and his wife Colleen Howe set up a tour with a book that had been ghost-written, actually largely written by Colleen as I understand it, but on players of some significance who had retired from the game, and hence after the applause, what they were doing with their lives after the game. It's actually a pretty good book. If you haven't, I don't know if you get it anywhere today or not, but they set up a tour across Canada, and you know, when they wanted to come to Ottawa, they sought me out. I got the call. You know, I wasn't any other bar in Ottawa. It wasn't a Lone Star beside us. It wasn't the Prescott Hotel. It wasn't any place else. It was the Original Six. And it was because of me, and I'm very proud of that. And they gave me a call and asked if they could come in. And we set this thing up. Now, this was months ahead. And we set it up. And not only that, CJOH TV, with the late Brian Smith as a sportscaster, decided to go live with sports there that night. And, you know, I only had 106 seats. We only had, me and my two partners, we only had 106 seats in that place. We probably had 206 people in there. But I know some people who were in there, and I still talk to them occasionally, and they thank me for making arrangements to get them in. Well, I was happy to. You know, if I could have got more, we would have. But that said, we had RocketRichard, Gordie Howe, Gump Worsley, and their wives, and Eddie Shack, without his wife, Norma. Eddie was by himself. And Rocket, we were packed. They were scheduled to arrive. If you remember the Six, small place, kind of divided by sort of a little bar area down the middle, where you could sit up on higher chairs on either side, very small area. And I was kind of standing at the end of it towards the kitchen, looking out, and I saw him coming through the crowd. I mean, this is a crowd of a couple hundred people, 1989, in Ottawa, Fisher and Baseline, right down the road from St. Pius, where I went to high school. And he's coming through the crowd. No one's even stopping him to talk to him, say hi. It's RocketRichard. And he was in, nobody else was in yet. It was like he came in basically he was looking for anybody official, I guess. I recognized him, so I went up to him. I said, Mr. Richard, I'm one of the owners, Liam McGuire. And we shook hands, And he said, I need a place for my wife to sit down. Those are his first words. His first words out of his mouth. Yes, sir. We've got an area reserved for you right up here. And he said, okay, I'll tell the rest of the guys. I said, I'll get them. He said, I'm going to get my wife. I said, okay. Hey, no problem. No problem. I'm not Bob Dylan. Don't worry. And so he went and got his wife, and Gordy and Colleen came in, and Smitty was already setting up by the window, and Rocket came in, and Gumper. Gump was the only guy who looked up and said, how'd you get the name the original six? That's isn't that trademarked? And I said, no, sir, it's not. Anyway, that's another story for another time. Anyway, they all came in, sat quiet as church mice, and then people started coming up for autographs and things of that nature. And I had a chance to talk to them, and I'll get into that in a second. But Brian Smith starts. I mean, the news at 6 would have started. Max keeping, of course, and away they went. Smitty normally came on same time as, Terry would have done, Bill Patterson, any of the guys over the years, same time, 6:30, 6:35, whatever. And I think this was November 29th, 1989. Anyway, so Smitty played briefly in the NHL, and he didn't play against the Rocket, but he played against Gordie Howe. So he wanted to do a live interview with Gordie Howe in the 6, so we did. And that's going on at the front of our bar, by the window, looking out toward Fisher Avenue. I'm at the back on the right-hand side, sitting beside the Rocket. And I'd been talking to him for about 15 minutes at that time about his career and everything. I've recounted that many times, both in print and publicly, privately, and whatnot. And during the interview, Smitty says, so, Gordy, what about a retirement? Or what about coming out of retirement, And Gordy was starting to think, turning into the 1990s, about if he played a game in the 1990s, it would mean he participated in 6 decades, and it's going on like this. RocketRichard was sitting right beside me and shot up like a cannon. And he yells out over the room, what about me? What about me coming out of retirement? Like that. Like even 29 years after he retired, and even though he's touring to promote this book with his wife, with Gordy and his wife, all animosity mostly buried at that point. And yet he shot up like a cannon when Smitty was talking to Gordie Howe about coming out of retirement. And he wasn't doing it, he was indignant. He was going, hey, don't forget about me. I'm right here. What about me coming out of retirement? Man, and his eyes, and he was just, he could feel it in his body, just the fibers in his body. And here he was at the time. He was born in 21, so he was 68 years old at the time. And I'll never forget it. It's the only time I ever met him, and it certainly was one of the highlights of my life. It definitely was. You want to talk about the cultural significance of RocketRichard, and as I said, I can't go back to what the people who lived through that era in the 40s and 50s, and the riot in 55 being an example of how he came to be a representative, sort of representing French Canada, if you will, and that's been well documented. But I'll say this, he died 20 years ago on this date, and I believe the wake, if I'm not mistaken, was June 2nd, the 2nd and the 3rd. So they had set the wake up to be at the Bell Center. May have still been called the Molson Center at that time, but regardless, the forum had closed. I'll get to that in a minute. But they had set the wake up, and my mother, is a French Canadian, and she was born in a little village north of Quebec City. Her and 5 sisters and a brother, so 7 in total. And 2 of her sisters lived in Montreal at that time. One has since passed away, Loretta. Maureen is still alive and still lives there. And my mom said to me, "Are you trying to go to any of the services?" I said, "I'm going to the wake for sure. I don't. The funeral's going to be a state service. I won't attend it, but I'm going to the wake." And she said, "Well, I want to go." And so does Maureen and Loretta. Now, is my mom a hockey fan? No, probably no more so than your mother was or is. I mean, yeah, we used to watch Hockey Night in Canada as a family. Maybe not Mike and Sean as religiously as I did with my parents, but that was a big thing on Saturday night. And my mom was a French Canadian, RocketRichard. I mean, the impact of Rocket's passing, what it meant to her and her sisters who lived in Montreal was significant enough that they wanted to pay their respects. Even though they didn't hang on every game that he played in the 1950s, listening to the radio or checking the statistics out and whatever their paper was, the Chronicle or whatever it was in Quebec at that time, that wasn't their raison d'etre, but it meant enough to them that they wanted to attend it. And so my mom and I drove down. I said, we got to go early. And we drove down and we met her sisters. And the four of us went in and stood in line dutifully. And for anybody who was there, you'll know that they set up the coffin right in the slot, right in the opposition slot, where if they were starting the game in the Bell Center that day, that's where Rocket would be shooting. And they put the coffin right there. And they had two lines of people going by. Beautiful music, lightly played, beautifully lit. And the family standing sort of in behind, and at times coming up to greet people, at times not. It was most important just to keep the people coming by and everybody could have a few seconds at the coffin, see the man lying in state, and then move on, and which we did. And it was solemn, it was beautiful, it was respectful, as you could imagine, but it was just such a feeling of it, and it just really kind of grabbed me, especially being there with my mother and her sisters who grew up, they're basically a decade younger than him. He was born in 21. My mom was born in 31. Her sisters were late 20s, early 30s. They grew up with him, knowing, that's all they knew on the Habs in Montreal, in Quebec, in the province of Quebec. He was the province. So the cultural significance I get through my mother and her sisters that day. And I'll just tell you one other quick little side note there. We were there early, and by the time we came out, it was about 9:30, 9:40 on a beautiful, beautiful summer morning in Montreal. And my mother and her sisters wanted to go to a patio somewhere, and just a little place somewhere to get a drink. And I went, yeah, it's not even 10 in the morning. I'm not going to get a drink. And they said, yeah, let's go. So we walked a couple blocks away from the Bell Center in towards the beautiful city of Montreal. And we found this little place. It was hustling and bustling. There was so many people out, so many coming from the wake. But, my mother and her sisters were a little elderly at that point too, obviously. 20 years ago, they were in their 70s, so themselves, late 60s, early 70s. And we got a place. We got a little place to sit down. Now, it's about 9:45, 10 to 10. And this waiter came over, impeccably dressed, and hair and everything, just and they immediately started talking in French, and they ordered. Like they ordered a glass of wine, and he asked where we'd been, and they said, I can understand a little bit of French, and they said we had been at Rocket's wake, and he went, okay, all in French, and then he said, and you, sir? And I said, oh, I'll have a Molson X. He said, okay. So it wasn't even 10 in the morning of Rocket's wake, and they had a glass of wine each, and I had a beer. And we talked about the Rocket. They talked about what it was like growing up, having him as this cultural shadow over French Canada, but definitely Quebecois. And I just talked about, as a Montreal Canadian fan and knowing of him and then meeting him in 89 and what that meant. I shared a little bit. I was more interested in them that day and what their memories and thoughts were of it and everything. It was amazing to me, absolutely amazing. And that's, to me, where I can speak to, at least I think, a little bit of the cultural significance of the man. So it was quite something. And that was supposed to be a finite time for that wake. They never closed the doors. The people never stopped coming. Over 115,000 people went by that casket in something like 36 or 40 hours or something. They just never shut it. They just had security and had police, and everybody just kept coming. And then, of course, he was given a state funeral. And which was befitting of the man, which is why we're talking about him, about his passing 20 years ago today. You talk about the other last part of significance of the man, and then I'll finish with a couple of telling statistics that I have discussed before. But on the final night of the Montreal Forum, the building that he lit up more than anybody else, really, I mean, you could make that case. Dick Irvin says it best, that RocketRichard was the most exciting player he ever saw. Guy Lafleur was the most exciting player he ever broadcast. That's how Dick Irvin describes it. So I'm going to take that as gospel, okay? I don't need to sit here and try and tell you from Liam McGuire's perspective, because Dick Irvin says RocketRichard was the most exciting player he ever saw in that building. That's good enough for me. And that was evident, the outpouring that final night, that Monday night, March 11, 1996. And I was in attendance again at that. And I was the last media person that left that dressing room that night at the Montreal Forum. And I was there with Dick Irvin most of that day. I arrived at 10:30 in the morning and went around with him all day as he did interview after interview after interview. He even did an interview with Swedish TV that afternoon. I'll never forget it. I was there the whole day. I had a ticket. I also had a press pass. And when the game ended, I took my ticket. I didn't care about sitting in the seat. I just went down and crammed in a standing room where I did so many times before in the 70s when I started going. I didn't actually sit in that building for about the first 5 years until I could even afford a seat. I used to just go down and stand in standing room. This is long after the Rocket had played. But I wanted to see the celebration on the ice, and I didn't want to be in press row. I wanted to be among the crowd. Because that was my 344th time in that building in 21 years for a hockey event, hockey games. So I went out in the crowd. And nobody watching on TV, or certainly in that building, was prepared for when the Rocket came on the ice for that ovation. And it's on YouTube now, and it has been exaggerated that it went 10 minutes and change. It didn't. It's 7 and change. If you don't think that's a long time, sit down and watch it. It's not just that it's 7 minutes and change, which is unheard of, and there's a couple others that are in the realm, but it's the outpouring of emotion. And as Dick Irvin said for years after, this was in 96, the night the Forum closed, the overwhelming majority of the people in the building never saw the guy play. They never saw him play. This is 36 years after his last game. And there were people crying all over the place. It was virtually impossible not to get emotional watching him respond on the ice to the adulation being shepherded on him from 18,000 plus people in the Forum that night in that iconic building, one of the greatest in the history of sports, definitely the best by far in hockey. Please don't give me Maple Leaf Gardens. It's in the same realm, but there's a difference, and it's called winning, and it's just not even in the same realm in that sense. I mean, it's, yeah, same realm, but not same area code, really. It's just different. And the Forum that night for RocketRichard was the outpouring of emotion, why we still remember the man 20 years later after his passing. So those are some sort of personal memories that I wanted to share today and try and draw in a little bit from the wake and the cultural significance through my mother and her sisters. And, you know, statistically, he broke into the NHL, scored his first goal November 8th, 1942, and he became the all-time goal-scoring leader in the NHL on the same date, 10 years later to the date. So speaking of anniversaries, on November 8, 1952, he scored career goal number 325, en route to 544, which stood until Gordie Howe broke it in 63. It's still a symbolic sort of number, as the guys that have scored 500 and have got up towards and past the Rocket. I remember even Guy Lafleur, you know, when he did pass the Rocket, and he did so as members of other teams, right? He went on to the New York Rangers and Quebec Nordiques, because the Rocket still is the career goal scorer leader on the Montreal Canadiens with that 544. But that was an NHL record at that time, and he was the first to 50. And another sort of little connection there. I mean, he got his 50th goal in 1945 on March 18th. Well, guess when my son's birthday is? Rory was born March 18th. So I've always drawn off that as well. Just another sort of symbolic gesture, if you will, and he became the, the first player to score 500 goals in the NHL, I believe October 1957, and, and retired with 544. And to me, though, it's the records that he did in the playoffs that signify the importance of the man as a hockey player, his will to win and his will to score. Red Story said, and he said this publicly many, many, many times, but I sat down with the late Roy Red Story, who, by the way, hated his first name being used. Absolutely hated it. But anyway, he went by Red, and quite a story in his own right. And I had a long chat with him about the Rocket, and man, he spoke with such passion about him. And of course, he used his telltale quote, that RocketRichard was put on this earth to score goals, and that's it, that's all. And he stated that many years ago, but he said it again for me that day, and that was up at the Montreal Canadian fantasy camps in the late 90s and early 2000s that I used to work for Maury Wilson at Montreal. Just incredible events. I'll never forget it. But anyway, in closing, the Rockets' playoff records, his 18 game-winning goals, his 7 hat tricks, his 6 overtime goals. He won 8 Stanley Cups, 4 as a captain. By the way, there's only 2 players in NHL history to win the Stanley Cup every year they were captain. RocketRichard and Yvan Cournoyer. Yvan is my favorite player of all time. Like I said, I got number 12 on this shirt. I got it in the 1970s. That's how old this thing is. They're the only 2 captains. They captained the Habs for 4 years. The Habs won the Cup every one of those years. The Rockets' playoff record stood for decades, and would have stood for decades more if the playoffs didn't expand in how many games you could play in a season and how many games that people could play in a career. Every single playoff game this man played, he was trying to go through a brick wall, either a player, the net, the goalie, whatever. He would do anything to score. Anything to score. And yes, I have stated Alex Ovechkin, I think over the base of a career now is the greatest goal scorer of all time. If you want to say singularly a Brett Hull, a Mike Bossy who still gets championed, and so he should. You want to talk about Wayne Gretzky and what he did, or Mario Lemieux, Bobby Hull. You can go down the line and come up with a lot of guys. And Ovi, I think, over the course of his career has proven time and again, winning yet again another RocketRichard trophy. It looks like this year it's official now, I believe. He's going to share it. Then with Pasternak. But RocketRichard, if you needed a goal scored at any moment in a game, it was absolutely critical to have that goal scored, to tie the game, to win the game, or to win it in overtime. There was one man you were going to tap on the shoulder, and one only. And it isn't any one of those guys. It is Maurice the Rocket Richard. That's who it would be. There is nobody, either from the blue line in, or if you needed that one goal scored in the history of hockey that you would want out there, other than Maurice the Rocket Richard. We lost him 20 years ago today, and he'll never be forgotten. So there's my little walk down memory lane for the Rocket. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope everybody's well, and we'll talk to you soon. And you know what? No, what am I doing? Christ, I'm not going to leave without toasting the Rocket. It's been so long since I've done one of these, I forgot. God, I need a haircut too. Yeah. Maurice, the Rocket Richard. Thank you, sir, very much. G'day.